Okay, so all good already? I'll press admit all and then you guys can start.
Okay, thanks, Autumn.
Yep, there we go.
Hi, and welcome. Good morning to everyone. My name is Eric Hans, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. But before I do that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Wilson, SIPE's Executive Director, to give a word of welcome to everyone that can participate this morning in our webinar on corporate governance after the pandemic, dramatic changes or just minor adjustments. So Andrew, I'll turn it over to you. A few introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and it's a pleasure you all this morning to join our panelists. And I'd like to offer my own personal welcome to you to this event. I think the title of the event is really something that we're not only just unique to corporate governance, but really to every aspect of our lives these days, whether or not these are indeed dramatic change to our operating environment, or whether this is just a matter of human nature and tweaking what we do and how we do it. But this is the first event in a series that we're calling Constructing a Vision for a Post-Pandemic World. And today's event on corporate governance is timely in that the response of the private sector to this worldwide tragedy has been one of constructive optimism, despite everything that's going on. Willingness of corporations and their boards to shoulder these burdens has been a key to that, and it's been really great to see how corporations have stepped up and taking part in this. You know, SIPE and has worked on corporate governance issues in emerging markets for 25 years, and I hate to date myself, but I've been around for most of that, and I hate to date Dan Koenigsberg, one of our speakers, but Dan has been working with SIPE for many years. I think Dan and I first traveled to Romania back in the mid-90s together, some corporate governance issues there, but more recently in Brazil, SIPE's been working closely with groups like the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance on issues from promoting and family-owned firms to our more recent work to improve corporate governance in state-owned enterprises, which I know is a timely issue these days. In Ukraine, where Eric is working and focusing his efforts, we've worked with the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Professionals Association to develop a registry of qualified and vetted independent directors that have the necessary skills and experience to private firms and state-owned enterprises. In Pakistan, we've worked with the Pakistan Institute for Corporate Governance, the Association of Chartered Accountants, on the corporate governance implications of concentrated ownership in listed firms. And in 2018, SIPE launched a new effort called the Anti-Corruption Governance Center to better integrate country-level programs across our organization's portfolio and to add to our own experience. We call it the ACGC, and really focuses on four key areas of some bearing on what we're going to be talking about today. It focuses on anti-corruption compliance. It focuses on private sector collective action to address corruption and governance issues. It looks at state-owned enterprise reform to ensure that there's greater accountability and control within state-owned enterprises. So they're more efficient and effective in returning the people's investment to them, or the returns on those investments, but also that they don't distort the competitive environment in the country, and that's very much in line with the OECD's own principles. And then finally, we're looking at corporate governance in general. And over the years, you know, our approach to corporate governance has evolved as the move itself. I think back to when Dan and I were starting off this work, we were having debates over what the terminology for corporate governance should be just in general, and whether we were looking at a shareholder model or a stakeholder model. And yet 25 years later, we're still sort of debating the merits of a stakeholder model versus the shareholder model. But in that intervening time, we've been looking at a lot of different aspects of corporate governance and how it's evolved. You know, the ACGC approach to looking at corporate governance, or the risk elements of corporate governance, is one element of that. The ACGC also maintains its own blog called the Business of Integrity, and SIPE staffers and our contributors to other such blogs such as the FCPA block. We've built our own capacity at SIPE to do a lot of this work, and Eric is evidence of that. One key program of the ACGC has been what we're calling a rapid reaction anti-corruption force, and that's to support transparent, pro-market democratic reforms through dramatic shifts in government in places like Armenia, Sudan, and the Gambia. You know, it seems as if the whole world is changing. It seems we need a rapid reaction policy team delivered to the four corners of the world. What this pandemic has highlighted is the importance of the private sector in supporting informed and constructive dialogue around government policy. You know, but I just have to, the nature of this dialogue has changed. I was just on a call before this one with our partners in the Middle East, and the voice we heard from them is the old rules don't apply. We have to think on the fly. We have to react more quickly. And I think that's a challenge even corporate boardrooms are having. So our old models of how we do advocacy, how we do dialogue are also changing, but that dialogue still continues, and it's continuing in other spheres as well. You know, the role of corporate governance, an issue in the 2008 financial crisis, was a subject of much debate. And in the decade that has followed the financial crisis, the concept of stakeholder governance, which I just mentioned, began to gain more buy-in from business and institutional investors alike. In 2019, Morningstar reported that sustainable mutual and exchange-traded funds held more than $137 billion in total assets at the end of 2019. Those organizations that measure environment, social, and governance goals, in addition to the financial bottom line issues. Strong majorities of investors were highly interested in sustainable investing, with millennials leading the trend. You know, likewise, a worldwide attention on corporate governance has led boards to institute wide-sweeping compliance programs to root out and prevent corruption. You know, in light of a looming worldwide economic downturn, the question becomes, do governance reforms get to the side, or are they now a core part of doing business? After the immediate survival of the company, what are boards concerned with? And importantly for SIPE, what can the priorities of these boards and of governance reform portend for the emerging markets where our partners are hard at work building business cultures that promote transparency and accountability? With those thoughts in mind, I'm going to turn things back over to Eric Hans to lead this discussion with our three experts who agreed to join us today, and I will thank them again on behalf of the organization. And I look forward to seeing the future events that we go forward, and I look forward to listening in on the discussion today. So Eric, I'm going to hand it back over to you, and good luck with the discussion, and I'll just be off in the sidelines here.
Thanks, Andrew, for the introduction and laying things out so nicely. I'd just like to welcome everyone once again to this online forum, and especially to welcome our three experts or guests here. I'll just introduce them briefly here. The first is Anat Beck. She's an assistant professor of law at Case Western University School of Law. And she's written some very interesting things. Anat and I first met at the Bruin Center for Social Entrepreneurship at NYU. And I've been following her writing and her career since we've met. And she has two interesting publications forthcoming related to governance. The G in ESG, which we first talked about a year ago. And one more, No More Old Boys Club, Institutional Investors' Fiduciary Duty to Diversify Corporate Boards. And so those two issues are especially timely in today's environment. But she did publish something recently that really caught my eye when I was looking to form this panel. And she published something called Preparing the Apocalypse, a multi-pronged proposal to develop countermeasures for biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear threats. And you know, while this is not a external event, it is an all-of-world event where we're having these, you know, massive shifts of resources, of talent, of capital that, you know, paper really presupposes. And so some of the suggestions in this paper, I think, are very, very timely to our current environment. Our second guest is Dan Koenigsberg. He's the head of global corporate governance at Deloitte. leading a network of 30-member firms engaging with clients, boards of directors, and audit committees. But he also helps lead the firm's 30-member firms that work with policymakers on important issues to the firm, on issues ranging from corruption to trade to women in business. Dan really works with boards of directors and sees it from the inside in the day-to-day, so I think his contribution here will be especially valuable. Dan also manages the Global Center for Corporate Governance and is a leader of Deloitte's public policy program. In addition to that, in his spare time, Dan also is the chair of Business at OECD's Corporate Governance Committee. So I think at the end of the day, Dan is up to his eyeballs in corporate governance and issues related to corporate governance and policy. And last but not least is our guest, Allison Taylor. She's the executive director of Ethical Systems. Ethical Systems' mission is to harness research from leaders in academia to transform ethical practice of business in the corporate world. So it leading from good ethics to good business. Her center is located in NYU Stern Business and Society program. In her Allison consults for multinational companies, runs risk analysis, anti-corruption analysis, works on sustainability issues, human rights, culture and behavior of the firm, stakeholder engagement, ESG issues, ethics and compliance. These I've tried to kind of create a rounded panel here so we can have a multi-stakeholder discussion from both the academic perspective, from the practical implementation perspective, and from civil society or cultural perspective from Allison. As Andrew mentioned, this is the first conference series of Constructing a Vision for a Post-Pandemic World. This series stems from work on the issue of corrosive and constructive capital. Corrosive capital on one end of the spectrum, this is an issue that SIPE has looked at for a few years. When we first started to notice that capital was not created equally, and that certain investments entering a market had a net positive effect on the market economic or market environment around them, and certain investments had a deleterious effect. We call the deleterious effect corrosive and the net positive effect constructive. These corrosive capital investments are those that are not necessarily market oriented, that are not transparent in entering the market, and that overall have a net negative effect on the institutions that's markets. On the other end of the spectrum, and it is a spectrum, constructive capital investments are those that enter the market transparently, support good market governance, and support a better enabling environment. Where does corporate governance fit into this whole scheme? A well company, even in a poor investment environment, so a company that's high on the Transparency National Corruption Perceptions Index, can best its competitors in getting a return and signaling for the market to follow. If we can get these corporate governance best practices ingrained across a country's private sector, creating a better business culture, that environment will be attractive to other constructive capital investments that create this virtuous cycle. SIPE, in its role, is trying to help companies and countries attract constructive capital through the creation of these effective corporate governance frameworks so that businesses can provide a foundation for sustained and stable economic growth that's more inclusive to citizens. Well, that was the prompt prior to COVID-19. That was the idea. And now, in light of all of this chaos in the markets, of negative oil prices, reduced FDI forecast, negative worldwide economic growth, we had to re-examine that. And the prompt that I want to kick this off with, and I'll note this for you, is that in the aftermath of the previous financial crisis, we saw this great shift in stakeholder governance models. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic and this economic devastation that we're seeing around the world, it seems to be this watershed moment, a do or die moment. for stakeholder versus shareholder governance models. Which trends do you think in governance do you see continuing, becoming more amplified, and which do you see maybe being set aside or regressing a bit? I know it's a big question to start with, but I'll give you some time, and then we'll go from Anat to Dan and Allison with the same question in mind. I would like to note that one more time that this is being recorded. It's just for our own internal uses. And I would like to note also that you can ask a question in the chat. There will be some time later on to ask questions. So Anat, if you could lead us off and chat a bit about that. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can.
So first, thank you so much, Eric. It's really an honor to be here with you today and to discuss something that is very, dear to my heart. But so the question you just posed, we've been dealing with it for, I want to say, over the last 200 years. And I've been studying this. Okay, what's the purpose of the corporation, especially today in the age of what I call ESG investments, right? So what's happening? What is the purpose of the corporation? Why does it matter? And I'm a legal scholar, so I'll start a little bit with how laws and regulations affect what we're seeing today. But first, let's start with this debate, okay? So it's an old debate. It's an old debate over the purpose of the corporation. It's part of what I like to say, it's the 1930s debate over the pages of the Harvard Law Review between two law professors. We have Adolph Burley and Merrick Dodd, and they're debating what is the role and responsibility of corporate managers and directors, right? What happens? And what you're going to see throughout history is that really changes around situations of prosperity or situations of economic crisis. So those views change based on what's happening around us. And I guess it's all cyclical, right? And it's feeding each other. And it's relevant today because of the pandemic, right? And also, in light of the fact that throughout that recent history, it was actually Burley's view that maintained as the dominant view. And that view is that the main purpose of the company is to increase the profits, the financial gains, and by doing so, to increase the value of the shares or the bonds to the benefit of the members or the shareholders of the company. And again, as you noted, in the last few years, we saw that it's chipping, but it's not surprising. That chipped before, if you looked at economic crises before, okay? So that dominant view that we see corporations going back to, we see that chipping, and let's even talk about 2008, right? We saw the public, and the public was about large corporations, about the bailouts, about the corruption, about the fraud, about the executives who manage them, even the institutional investors who invest in these companies, okay? They demanded a change. And today, especially with the pandemic, we're gonna see companies dealing with solidarity, with cooperation, how decisions affect not only shareholders, but also society. Now, again, a little bit more about the history. So in the past, we saw this rise in calling to focus on Wall Street, on shareholder profits coming from Milton Friedman, Michael Jensen, the Chicago School of Free Market Economists. And the criticism was, okay, they're calling to focus on Wall Street supremacy, on trading, on short-termism. How, if you're putting so much pressure on management of public companies and on how their companies are going to perform based on decisions they're going to make, that's going to affect their decisions in investment in R&D, in taking on risky projects, which by the way lead to innovation. And so that really changes the way these companies operate, whether they're profitable, and how does that influence stakeholders, and who are stakeholders, right? Are we looking at stakeholders as communities? Are they customers? Are they employees? Who are they? Suppliers to the company? Is it the nation? Is it, international? Again, there's a lot of debate on terms. What is clear, though, is that we have today scholars, policymakers, business leaders, right? They're calling for a radical economics. Is realized that their operations have a huge impact on our society, on our environment, and we're taking that into account. We're taking into account that people are going to be affected by corporations, not only as shareholders, but also as consumers, as employees, as members of community in which these corporations operate. And so at least we're telling rhetorics, right? Had those discussions. We're telling managers, okay, we need to take these into account. I have to say, still very challenging. Why? Because, for example, if you're incorporated in the United States, right? And let's take a look at Delaware. I was just invited. Actually, I was in Maryland before the pandemic, and we were discussing Delaware courts and how are to face this challenge, right? All these people who are putting pressure on management to take into account stakeholders. And today, at least if you look at the case law, right? When a board member has to make a decision whether they can take those other things into account when they make a decision. When you look at the minutes, when you look at the discussions, when you look at the deliberations, can they take other things into account without disregarding profit? Okay, or that's why I said the middle way. You see that changing as well. Say that you're taking those other things into and that will actually increase profit. But then how do you measure that? What are the metrics for measuring taking those other aspects into account? And so the question and the debate today is, how are we going to establish goals? What is the main purpose of the corporation? And you're seeing institutional investors speaking out. In the past, they were afraid to do that. I think a lot of it has to do with pressure from the younger generations, especially the millennials. And how is that going to affect our climate change? You see the Me Too movement, issues of diversity on boards of directors, whether there's representation in the governing body of people who make decisions. And now with the pandemic, when it's affecting, just think about us, countries around us, the world. How are we going to take those issues into account? I think especially at times of economic crisis and pandemics, you'll see this rhetoric come up again. What I would like to make sure that it's, how can we do it so it's not just rhetoric? It's not just, companies having this is a PR opportunity, but rather really taking measures to influence the stakeholders to make a difference in our lives. That I think will be the big push, the big change. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anat. That's an interesting overview to get us kicked off, so everyone knows where we're at. And if we have you, I think we might have lost you temporarily. Danny, you there? And as usual, technology is not 100% perfect. So Allison, I'd like to offer you the same prompt. In the aftermath of the crisis, we saw the shift towards the stakeholder governance model, and now the pandemic comes around. Where do you think, from your consulting work, from your experience with ethical systems, where are we gonna land? What are the trends that are going to be continuing here, and what is going to stop?
Hi, Eric, and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. So I'll try and follow that great historic overview that we had already, but I'll take my starting point as the 2008 global financial crisis. Definitely true to say that in those years, we've seen a shift to stakeholder models, but obviously also a very strong argument that the lack of meaningful reckoning after the 2008 crisis is one of the reasons that we have seen increased polarization, inequality, political division, impunity, and of course, rocketing social and environmental problems. And so a lot of that, we might argue, is because there was not a large-scale reckoning for the shareholder value model after 2008. But if we really think about the last 12 years, a lot of things have been pretty transformational in the responsible business, world. And I would point to several factors. The first one I would point to is hyper-transparency, and this is also the trend that supercharges all of the other trends that I'm about to talk about. So the internet, obviously not a new thing, but if you think about how far and how fast internet adoption has traveled since 2008, and I think very often miss the degree to which internet adoption is still skyrocketing in the global south, that has really transformed the operating environment for companies and by implication really transformed corporate governance trends. So a dramatic shift of power around access to information and how companies need to think about information and confidentiality. We've obviously seen the fragmentation of media, the growth of social media, and the increasing ability to share real-time information with a wide audience of people. You've therefore seen NGOs increasingly getting real-time information from local communities to put reputational pressure on multinationals. We have seen, beginning with Edward Snowden and going through WikiLeaks, and now every time you open the newspaper, you see employees leaking confidential information to the public domain. That has really left today's corporations in a position where they need to behave as if everything they say or do might become public knowledge, and it has undermined the power of things like confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements for companies to kind of control the information flow, control their PR profile, and really overall create a kind of top-down information dissemination about who they are and what they stand for. So now you're operating in a much more dynamic and really threatening information environment where dialogue with a whole range of stakeholders is really essential if you want to maintain your reputation. We've also then seen the rise of activism, and this is particularly the case in the last couple of years. There was a prediction at the beginning of the year from Maplecroft that there would be political protest in 40% of countries this year. There's also a really good report from CSIS talking about the drivers of these political protests, which are very often things like corruption. Now, of course, at the moment, most of us can't go out of our houses, but it doesn't mean that that rage is going away. It doesn't mean that people are less angry just because they can't leave their houses. And so that anger with governments, that those demands for better social services really kind of skyrocketing, and companies being caught up in the crossfire there. And in parallel, we've seen, particularly in the last few years, particularly in the US, and particularly but not exclusively in tech, rising employee activism. So it goes back to my whistleblowing model, where leaking confidential information to the media to put pressure on your employers is a huge trend. And I would argue a trend in general to democratize organizations for employees to actively shape values and strategy from the bottom up in a way you didn't see before. You're also seeing the convergence of legal and voluntary oversight functions. I think an increasing recognition that control-based anti-corruption programs don't do much unless you tackle the systemic impacts of corruption, things like repeated demand for facilitation payments. And then more recently, nascent scrutiny and oversight of human rights. So lots of countries in Europe putting in place human rights due diligence requirements and increasing scrutiny over modern slavery and trafficking. So that convergence of human rights and anti-corruption and of public anger over corruption happening. And then a lot of this is playing out in terms of the focus on the supply chain and the focus multinational being held responsible for what goes on in their supply chains. We can think about Rana Plaza, we can think about the construction industry in the Gulf, we can think about slave labor in the seafood supply chain, we can think about conflict minerals. But that visibility of what goes on in the supply chain really kind of growing. In ethics and compliance and anti-corruption, an increasing recognition as well that criminalization and kind of don't do that, don't break the law processes actually don't work very well. We certainly haven't seen any lack of corporate governance and corruption scandals, despite the growth of the compliance profession. So a move towards thinking about culture and behavior and what inspires and motivates employees, which again drives this corruption between voluntary and regular oversight functions. And, you know, finally, the rise in ESG, huge growth in investor interest in these topics, some beginning of professionalization of metrics, and an acceptance that long-term sustainability is material. So I don't think it's a big mystery why investors have turned to ESG. There's a growing number of studies just showing that good ESG management correlates with good long-term financial performance. So that's what was going on, or that's what I would have said if you'd asked me these questions in late 2019. So now really the question is, which of the trends I just talked about are going to accelerate, which are going to get derailed? And something that's happening at the moment is everybody can make a case for what they think the future will be like, depending on your biases. You can make a case democracy is in crisis and authoritarians have done a better case here. You can make a case that of course, ESG is going to rise now because we're in the middle of a pandemic and a climate crisis. You can also make a case that ESG is going to collapse because companies need to focus on essential survival and they don't have time to think about these feel-good voluntary processes. So I'm not going to pretend that I know this is all going, but I would point to a few things. Hypertransparency is still here. Something that's been very notable is the degree to which corporate behavior is being scrutinized by the general public. Huge numbers of articles about corporate saints and sinners, who is still paying dividends, who's still doing share buybacks and laying off their employees. So lots of pressure on how companies treat their employees in reputational terms, and arguably a new focus from the ESG world on labor rights. Now, what happens to that in an era of 20% unemployment and reduced employee power? I'm not sure, but something's got to give here, and we've got the broad context automation and demographic shifts. So, you know, we need to think about the future of labor rights and where that's all going to land. I would make a hesitant prediction that we see the end of gig economy models and it being considered acceptable that you have those kind of rights over your workforce without corresponding obligations. Employee activism may have become constrained in an era of 25% unemployment, but the political active trends will not go away. And so rising concern over company relationships, lobbying, transparency, tax responsibility, I think will be one of the outcomes of this crisis. What the prospects are for political reform in democracies, at least non-electoral politics, which are increasingly polarized. So we're seeing either quite big swings in policy, just political gridlock. So I'm not sure what the reform prospects are in the US or Europe because of those things, but I do think we will see a long overdue discussion about the respective roles of government and business and the relationship between business and politics. And also a more robust discussion about the limits to what business can do without an effective policy environment. I think there's a stronger case for the convergence of oversight functions because it couldn't be clearer that legal risk and what the public thinks is good corporate behavior are not correlated very much anymore. Culture is, of course, elevated in a remote work environment and in an economic crisis. Lots of calls for more effective and ethical leadership. And then finally, on the future of ESG, whether more companies pursue ESG strategies or not, I think will depend a lot on finances. But we may emerge here with a more simple and fundamental concept of ESG. At the moment, it's very jargon heavy, it's very fragmented, it's not very robust. Perhaps we'll emerge from the crisis with the idea that a good ESG leadership is first do no harm, don't be a hypocrite, treat your employees okay, before we get into these more kind of nuanced judgments. So maybe a simpler and more fundamental reckoning for what ESG is, even if we don't see a broader adoption of ESG. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but we're running short of time.
Well, okay, Alison, I was writing quite a few things as you were speaking there, and you know, coming back to the last point that you made brings up something that Anat brought up first, was that definitions. And so, you know, if you're working in securities industry, definitions are important. And so defining what it is that we're looking at and what we're measuring is very important. I think that Alison, you're right on target, and you kind of dovetailed nicely with what Anat had to say. Dan, I think we have you on the line now.
Yeah.
All right, Dan. And so same question to you. You know, we have the financial crisis and the shift towards stakeholder governance. Now we have the pandemic. And where do we see this going? And where does your perspective come in on this point?
Right. And first of all, thank you for having me. And you'll be very pleased to know that technical problems are keeping me from having you to look at my ugly face for the next 10 minutes or whatever. But it's great to be here and to be back with SIPE, who, as Andrew said, I've worked with for many years and think very highly of. On the shareholder stakeholder debate, this is an old debate, as Anat told us. Before the crisis, you know, I think it was said earlier, you know, we had Larry Fink from BlackRock, the world's largest investor, back in January 2018, saying, you know, companies have to adopt a social purpose, that it wasn't enough to make money, throwing Milton Friedman out the window, at least to some degree. You know, BlackRock was not alone. We also saw folks like Mark Benioff at Salesforce. He's another big name. This was before the crisis, saying, you know, the purpose of business is to improve the state of the world. It's not to make a profit. Now, you can be a cynic. You can say, we point out people like Larry Fink and Mark Benioff because they're the only ones. It's not as if we have hundreds of CEOs out there spouting similar things. You can be cynical and ask if this is genuine. You know, a lot of firms are trying to attract and retain millennial employees who want to work at companies that are doing something good for the world. That much is clear. And so there are lots of firms that talk a good game. Since the coronavirus crisis, I would argue the debate has shifted from what I'm seeing. You know, I work with boardrooms every day with all my clients around the world. And I would argue that the debate has shifted not so much, you know, a little bit away from purpose and doing good, and a little bit more about what you might call harm reduction, or at least a great deal more thinking about how the social contract is changing between companies and societies in which they operate. So not just license to operate questions, although that's part of it, but just what are the expectations now? How can we reduce harm given the great harm that is going around us every day with the virus? And in particular, how should companies behave if they receive government money? And in the U.S., you know, where health insurance is tied to employment, this has led to, no small amount of hand wringing in corporate boardrooms about what to do. So what we're hearing is that there are increasing expectations for companies today, especially those who take government funding, and maybe even for those who don't. And maybe I'd list 3 or 4 things. One, to take a lot more care and consideration of employees' health. Even if you don't, you're expected to mouth the right things and say the right things and do a bit more than you did before. You're expected not to fire or lay off thousands of employees if you can at all help it. Yes, survivability and survival is the most important thing, but within that, especially if you're a large employer, people will be looking. There's an expectation to relook at supply chains. That's been mentioned already. Just in time and very far-flung supply chains don't work very well in circumstances like these. We're leading to shortages and all kinds of things, and I think there are expectations around that too that we'll see. And I think there's an expectation that large businesses will work with government to improve things. We've seen in the US, both GM and Ford have retooled their production lines to manufacture ventilators. In France, you've got places like LVMH, that's Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. If you don't know, they have converted their perfume line to hand sanitizer. In China, we've seen Foxconn producing its own face masks for their own production and for others, largely because the government requires face masks if you're going to do anything. So a little bit more around what I would call, hand in hand, large businesses with governments. That's a changing expectation. But I would also say it goes further. I think for those companies who have received government support, there are questions not just about behavior, but about use of capital. And maybe just 3 examples around capital that we're seeing today. One, the use of buybacks, share repurchase programs, very popular in most Western markets. Even companies using debt to buy back their shares over the last several years, quite common. We've seen shareholder groups in particular and some governments say, look, if you're going to take our government money, we don't want you to use it to buy back your shares. And many have also argued against dividends. That would be the second area. Dividends, I think, are more controversial. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that dividends help economies in a lot of ways, in ways that perhaps buybacks don't. But they're sort of, I think, bunched up together in a lot of people's minds as quote unquote inappropriate in the current environment. I think boards are looking at this. They're saying this not only can look bad, but is this the best use of our capital at this time? Not all shareholders are standing in the way of other ways of using capital. We've seen some governments, for example, have tried to create more flexible ways that you can raise equity. For example, in many parts of the world, you have preemption rights, meaning that existing shareholders have the sort of a right of first refusal to buy new shares. And at least in the UK, shareholder groups have said that's all right. You can go ahead. You can increase. You can issue shares up to 20% of new equity, and we won't have to have that right of first refusal. The third area is executive pay. You can imagine this is quite a big topic. I think anyone who's serving on a compensation committee today is facing enormous challenges. There are calls, to cut bonuses, enormous scrutiny over CEO pay, particularly at those businesses that have cut staff. It is very unlikely that CEOs will hit their performance targets this year. And so what do you do if you're a board? Do you adjust those targets? Do you lower them? Do you apply discretion so that executives can get something? The reverse can be true. I spoke to the compensation committee chair at Reckitt Benckiser, which is the world's largest, or among the largest household product manufacturers out of Amsterdam. They make Lysol, Dettol. Their revenues have gone bananas. I mean, they've gone through the roof. And I think their question is, is it appropriate for the CEO to hit 200, 300% of target? Again, what is the social contract with society? So ultimately, if you're asking me for what do I, if I have a crystal ball, and I agree with Allison, you can make a case for a lot of things today, but I'd point to 2 predictions. One, we're going to see a renewed debate about oversight of companies and governance in general. We haven't seen so much of this, but I expect this will be driven by a few calamitous corporate failures. You know, these won't be bankruptcies like J. Crew or J.C. Penney or Avianca, the airline from Colombia, which just sought bankruptcy protection. Retail and airlines, of course, will be hit, but I think that old Warren Buffett line will hold true. You know, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked, right? Meaning that, you know, who has bad business plans, who's perhaps doing something not quite right or unethical, who's fudging the numbers. We should expect there will be corporate failures, and it will be another cyclical look at governance again, and that will bring unexpected consequences. The second and last thing I'll say is just the role of government. We've been talking about it throughout. I think plainly, if you're going to demand collective sacrifice from everyone in society, then the system has to work for everyone, and it clearly doesn't in many countries. Lockdowns are imposed in the greatest cost off. These are frontline people, cleaners, carers, you know, healthcare workers, and I think we're going to see a greater push. You know, depending on how, you know, people have different views about this, but for a more equal society in some ways, that if you're going to have a business that's going to succeed in a very unequal society, you're going to have problems. That we depend on healthcare systems that work for businesses do, and it would cost more for business to operate if you don't have these things. So this has, I think, deep implications for how businesses run and for boards of directors and overseeing the businesses. And it's just going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Fascinating to see, but also, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And so the level of uncertainty is really through the roof. And we don't, you know, we know that business doesn't like uncertainty. They like things to be regular and predictable. And you look at the number of companies that have suspended their predictions or their forecasts, and it's through the roof. But you know, one thing that I hear, and I'd like to throw this open to all of our panelists, is the fundamental relationship, you know, is changing between business and government. And you know, to this point, we've had some, you know, I think some interesting revisions in corporate governance codes. Most recently, the code in China in 2018, and the code for the Japanese stock market in 2018 as well. Both of these codes took more of the stakeholder approach to corporate governance. And the last time that the OECD has revised its corporate governance principles was in 2015. And there is a lot of space in there for the incorporation of ESG or sustainable business principles. So my question to you would be, you know, is it, you know, traditionally the kind of thinking has gone from west to east. You know, will there be a thought process east to west? And, you know, can we predict whether or not, or can we if there will be additional influence from the east and a more ESG model?
I'm happy to jump in. I'll be the terrible American and say no. I just think it's unlikely. I could be wrong. We're at the very early stage of this, but you know, if you look at governance trends and in the direction they go, it rarely goes east to west. You know, if you're sitting in America, very little has come here. You know, even the gender diversity trend, which is probably one of the largest over the last 5, 6, 7 years, struggles to have any kind of impact in the U.S. You know, the OECD, you know, does update its corporate governance principles every decade or so. I have not heard a glimmer of hope that they're going to, you know, open it up again in the next year or two. Again, things could change quickly. You know, I would like to think that, you know, the Western world is open to a more stakeholder model, but I just don't see too much on the horizon at the moment.
Anat?
Yes, and I have, I just wanted to jump on that and mention a few things that I'm seeing. First, and thank you, Dan. Yes, that's very much That's very correct. Let's talk about a few things. I'll talk about gender diversity, about tech, and overall what we're seeing here in the US, and compare it even to the EU and the UK, okay? So in the US, we're still more conservative. We see that a lot of the development, a lot of the progress in other countries, unfortunately, it comes here in later stages or not really at all. You might be able to see it in rhetorics, but when you look at the numbers there, and let's start with women and gender diversity, okay? It's very easy. All you have to do is take a look at numbers and take a look at boards, who are the bodies that govern the companies, right? Even with BlackRock, even with State Street, even with Vanguard, they're calling for what? More diversity, having more women on boards. How many women do they have on the boards? Very easy. Take a look at the number. Okay, it's not 50%, I can tell you. Okay, so talk about quotas, right? And you've seen in countries around the world, you've seen quotas. In the US, we only have it so far in California, and there's a lot of resistance, right? And in terms of litigation, you also already see advocacy groups who have filed a lawsuit with the district court. Now it's going to go up to appeal. They're probably hoping to get to the Supreme Court. That's going to have to weigh in on whether what California did, whether it's constitutional or not, okay? That's with regards to diversity. Now, let's talk about employees' rights, okay? Again, you see great rhetoric. For example, forget about even public companies. Let's take private companies, something that I've been documenting. What's going on in private companies in tech? What we've seen in the past few years, at least in the past 10 years, this rise of unicorns, these companies that you never saw before. These are private companies that are worth over $1 billion. And what you've seen inside is there's clashes with employees. Employees are usually the talent. They are the ones in the tech that are responsible for the advancement in these companies. They were promised in the past that one day, if the company is successful, you're taking on this risk, you join this startup, one day if it's successful, there's going to be an IPO, you're going to be very rich, and you're very rich on paper, but the company's private and it's staying private longer. Why? Because they don't want to be subject to being a public company. They don't want to be subject to analysts. They don't want to be subject to public scrutiny. They don't want to be subject to any pressures that are coming from the public. So as long as they're able to continue to stay private longer, they're going to stay private longer. Okay, so these employees are using social media, they're using online platforms, and they are complaining against their companies and are trying to push these companies, at least until today, to go public so they can have a liquidity event because these employees are in these companies. And the companies are taking this very seriously. For example, Airbnb just laid off 25% of its workforce. Read the letter from the CEO. Okay, it's very compelling when you read it. And I've read a lot of commentary on it. Oh my God, it's amazing the way he's talking to the employees. They're going to give them health benefits for another year. But then I took a look at the numbers. Take a look at the numbers. It's great work that's actually coming from Israel. Look at the statistics. What's the majority of, if you look at who's being laid off, the majority of the people who are being laid off, and I'm suspecting it's not just Airbnb. Who do you think? It's women. Okay? So majority of the employees that are being laid off are women, and you see how women are affected by the pandemic around the world. If it's violence from home, if it's their right in the workplace, are we going to see more change? I don't know. I hope so. Okay, so that's with regards to employees. That's with regards to women, and I think something that is also incredibly, incredibly important, and that is government interference in the market. You still have this debate. Do we want the government as a market player? Do we not want a government as a market player? Whereas in other countries, it's actually, there is no debate. Of course, the government's going to be a market player, and the government's going to catalyze innovation and entrepreneurship, and they're going to pump money if they need to, and they're going to help create jobs, and they're going to help the industries that are in need. But here, it's not that clear. There's still a debate. Okay, so we're not even there yet. And when you talk to people, even about innovation, even about tech, they're like, oh, we don't want government having anything to do with it. And I look at history and I read about legal systems and about how things started, and I tend to say, really, you think things just come out of thin air? You don't think that governments have anything to do with it? That policies have nothing to do with it? That laws and regulations that we put in place have nothing to do with it? They have a lot to do with it. Okay, so I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that respect.
Thank you, Anat. That's definitely a bit of a different, really well laid out. Allison, I'd like to get you to chime in as well. And what are your thoughts, especially from your perspective? I mean, you do a lot of advisory on compliance and ethics. And so where does that fit within all of this, regardless of the legal system, regardless of what is written on paper? What do you think companies will be doing going forward?
I think there are a few things I'd highlight. I mean, I think it's right that we will see a rise, perhaps dramatic, in corruption and fraud scandals because of our Warren Buffett example. I think, and if we think about ESG vis-a-vis ethics and compliance, I still see an interesting disconnect, which is when ESG investors talk about the G in ESG, they are usually talking about things like diversity on boards and executive pay and that kind of thing. They are not looking necessarily at a company's anti-corruption compliance program, which I think is usually viewed as being table stakes and something that can be delegated and something that's not that strategic or interesting. Now, that's clearly not true. You can have the most state-of-the-art compliance program in the world, and if trying to operate in a market where there is repeated demand for facilitation payments, or the market is just fundamentally distorted, a kind of program that deflects regulatory scrutiny is not going to help you tackle those challenges. So I think we are seeing a nascent shift from thinking about corruption as the risk to the company and thinking more about the impact of corruption on society and human rights, and a growth in traction for collective action around tackling integrity issues and around things like beneficial ownership. So I would hope that that would continue. I'm not sure. I think a lot of it depends on where we head with electoral politics. The other big thing to flag, and it goes back to the issues I raised at the beginning, is the increasing regulation of the supply chain. So historically, companies have very often had a third-party compliance due diligence program focused on agents, distributors, that kind of thing. And then they've had a supply chain oversight program, which is focused on voluntary disclosure and audits and environmental and social standards. So two completely separate programs. But as supply chain becomes more of a regulatory risk because of human rights issues and modern slavery and trafficking, there's then more of a driver to think about integrity in the supply chain and to try to work with suppliers, not just to build higher environmental and social standards, but to help them with governance and integrity issues. And that's very intuitive. If you're paying bribes, you're also quite to be violating environmental standards and not treating your employees well. The problem, I think, is that we don't yet have a consensus on what good supply chain oversight looks like. Companies are completely overwhelmed by this challenge. Where the risks lie are usually 5 or 6 tiers down. They're not in your tier 1 suppliers. And so nobody has yet come up with anything sensible saying, this is what your oversight process needs to be. This is how far you need to go, and so on. And so I think you see companies kind of paralyzed. I saw a survey from Refinitiv saying 43% aren't doing anything at all because this is such a difficult challenge. And so the reputational pressure is there. You might suddenly get exposed for slave labor somewhere way down in your supply chain, but how you actually feasibly prevent that, I'm not seeing anyone come up with anything particularly smart. However, transparency is rapidly increasing. And so mapping and understanding your supply chain is more in sight than it had been before. I mean, the final thing I think is that corruption and ethical finance issues are far more of an issue of public concern than they used to be. It used to be that human rights would get people really exercised. It's much more emotive, it's much more visceral. Corruption seemed kind of dry and secondhand, but we now see people on the streets protesting corruption. People that live in New York and San Francisco realize the reason they can't buy a house is because of all this laundered money sloshing around the property market. And so rage over corruption and abuse of political power by corporations, I don't think is going anywhere, which is part why I go back to this point about a reckoning for the relationship between and politics. I think is long overdue in the US. I think is already underway in Europe.
Yeah. Dan, I mean, would you like to say, I mean, so the relationship between, you know, business and politics obviously is an issue. And Allison brought up that interesting point that, you know, used to be human rights was the issue that boards were paying attention to, and that was given the majority of time. And now it seems to be corruption. And so is that, where do you come in on that with what you're hearing?
Well, I would like to think that good boards are still looking at both, and my experience is that really good boards do. You know, I agree with a lot of what Allison said, and I think you can be optimistic, look at a number of trends and say that perhaps things will start to change for the better. The part at the end that Allison spoke about the day of reckoning, I mean, I do think one of the consequences of this time with the virus will be a closer look in many places about the, you know, corrosive links, to use Sipes' term for corrosive capital, right? But non-constructive links between government and business. I think people will look at that, and this we may look back in a few years and say this is one of those areas, those times of great reform. You know, one can perhaps hope for something like that. I do think on ESG that. You know, I also serve on the board of governors of the ICGN, the International Corporate Governance Network. It's the largest investor network, essentially, that looks at governance and ESG. And what I see is that asset owners and asset managers are beginning to, you know, and I say that advisedly, but are beginning to look at the S in ESG a bit more than before. And again, I think the virus will bring that out. You know, how are people taking care of their employees? How are they behaving as constructive players in society? I think that there are a number of large investors that are really spending time grappling with that. What are the metrics? How do you make comparisons that are rational and reasonable? That is happening, and I don't think that was happening a few years ago. And then lastly, on you know, if you want to be optimistic on supply chains, I mean, I think, you know, if you've got these 6 level down layers in your supply chain, yes, that's really difficult. You know, but we're seeing a shortening of supply chains. If we've seen anything over the last 3 months, it is people have realized the limits of far-flung supply chains. And from a government perspective, you know, there are national reasons why you probably don't want certain basic supplies like personal protective equipment or ventilators or hand sanitizers and the like made in just one country, or one country that's very far away that, you know, that may be experiencing problems. And so to the extent we see a shortening of supply chains, I think that this debate becomes just a little bit, not saying it's a panacea, that everything is better, but gets a bit better. So I think, as I said earlier, still very early to know the long-term consequences of what we're living through, but there will be some big ones, and these might be a few of them.
Thanks, Dan. Let me bring in some questions from the chat here. Indra Klein is asking about, you know, since we have this investor sentiment among millennials that they want to see more sustainable business models, where are the millennials on the boards? You know, where, in terms of board diversity, you know, what's the age that boards are looking at for new board members? And would the presence of a cohort or a generation that is more interested in sustainable business, how is that going to have knock-on effects to board governance? And then again from Indra is a question to Anat about providing examples of a board of directors or companies that have conducted business with strong social responsibility as a strong component of their ethos. So Anat, those are two questions that look aimed at you.
Sure. So thank you so much, Indra. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. So first, let me talk about the millennials quickly. So what a lot of companies are concerned about is actually to get the millennials as the workers, but also as investors, right? They're the future. We're going to have hopefully new customers, and they want millennials to invest in companies. So in terms of diversity, there's a study every year that comes out with regards to gender diversity and age diversity. And they ask company CEOs of large companies how much do they care about these issues. So last year, they cared 41% about gender diversity on the board, 37% about age diversity. Okay, just to show you that yes, definitely they're trying to take that into account. So age is definitely a factor to be taken into account. Now that does not mean that you're going to find millennials on the board, and if you do, please let me know where. Okay, because I'd love to see that. I would love to see if we're going to have millennials on the board before we have women on the board, because right now at least the numbers in terms of gender diversity are still very gloomy, especially in the United States. So that would be a trend that would be interesting. Let's see if we're going to be able to get any millennials on boards. And by the way, I just want you to note that there is even controversy in academic circles on whether diversity is even important. I mean, honestly, that to me is mind-boggling. But there are some studies that try to claim that it's not definitely going to be effective for a board to have diversity or other voices. Again, yes. Yeah, sure.
Eric,
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that millennial question?
Yeah, Dan.
Is it all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget, millennials are 40 today. I mean, they're between 30 and 40. They've got a mortgage. These aren't 20-year-olds anymore, just to remind people. Sometimes people say millennials, and what they is, Generation Z or something younger. But I will tell you, I work with a lot of boards, and 55 is still a young age to be on a board. A lot of boards won't even look at you until you're, a few years older than that. 57, 59, 60 is better. And, again, I hate to be the old fogey here. I just don't think we're going to see younger people on boards. I mean, I think they want people who are seasoned, who have lived through a crisis, for example, or two, and you just don't have that, at 40 generally. Now there are exceptions, and you see these, if you're the chief innovation officer at Google and you're 29, that's unlikely. But you're in your 30s, there are a few of those. There are boards that set up advisory councils of younger people. And if you're targeting younger people as a business, an exception too. But it's just, I don't think we're going to see a whole bunch of millennials on very large boards soon.
Yeah, I mean that is a valid point. That typically boards are made up of seasoned professionals. But it's interesting that there's such a stark generational divide. I mean, you do have substantial majorities of even older investors being concerned about sustainability issues. But when then you cross over to the millennials, and it's up 20 to 30 points in the surveys that I've seen. A question here from Anne Hemingway about the question on impact of corporate perspective, COVID-19 and climate crises, and how is it driven in local economies? And so how do boards incorporate or square COVID-19 with these with the climate issues, and then square that with the responsibility to local communities. And Allison, maybe you can take that.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of responsible business people making the case aggressively online that we will now see companies focus much more on climate and much more on public health crises like pandemics. These are all, though, big systemic issues, and I would argue that boards and enterprise risk management processes in general have been quite poor at managing and anticipating those historically. So you tend to see sustainable business kind of corporate reports talking about material issues, and then you see enterprise risk management processes really trying to avoid tackling things like the climate crisis and pandemics, partly because of a lot of biases in how risk management is done. You need to have an owner, you need to be able to show clear mitigation, you need to have something that you can do as a company, and so it's an uncomfortable message. There's this giant crisis and the best we can do is kind of plan and respond. We have, however, seen the emergence of the TCFD, which is a climate framework that necessitates scenario planning and thinking about business resilience in the context of various scenarios. So that's a bright spot in how we might incorporate these big systemic challenges into company risk and oversight processes. Because at the moment, I think these things are so challenging. I mean, at the moment, we can describe the pandemic as a crisis that's driven by our environmental practices that has social consequences. And I think most frameworks even struggle to tackle and address the context and the intersection between environmental and social risks. They're often treated as if good environmental performance and good social performance all head the same way. But of course, if you close a factory, that's going to have a good impact on the environment and a terrible impact on social factors. So I don't think we've got very far with considering how companies can map and address these systemic issues, but climate frameworks are the way forward through scenario planning and then through thinking about emissions in the supply chain. So I have done some work with big multinational companies thinking about risks and resilience in their supply chain. How do we source mangoes if it's too hot in India for people to go to work? And what can we do about that? The danger is, of course, that their conclusions are, let's cut off these local economies and protect ourselves and shorten our supply chains, as Dan was talking about. And that has a negative effect on economies in the global south. So but then we still need these commodities, we still need these goods. There are only a few countries you can still source things from. And so the optimist's view would be that there's a little bit more supplier power because of all this reputational risk over the focal organization. The negative view would be more automation, less humans that can get sick, more local sourcing, and a lot more economic problems in the developing world.
I think that kind of gets into Katia Lasova, a colleague of mine, her question here about public monitoring of companies and where the public comes in in interaction and keeping companies honest to their word. And Allison, I think you brought this up earlier, where during the crisis, public monitoring during the crisis is a factor that corporations can take into account in decision making. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that reputational dynamics have really, really changed. The value of intangible factors like reputation in driving corporate value is higher than before. Companies are very, very concerned. You know, having said that, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of misinformation, there is a lot of stuff that is not getting flagged. So I guess I go back to this point about employees being this really, really powerful interest group. It also picks up on the discussion we were just having about millennials and Gen Z. So millennials are 40, they're very concerned about ESG issues. Gen Z are exponentially more concerned. And so we're now seeing, if we think about all our workforce that's under 40, we are seeing a big cohort of people trying to drive change from the bottom up. They're also less concerned with respecting the status and power of their elders. They are querying the client relationships. They are querying whether their employers ought to be working for oil and gas companies. And if they do not like the answers they see, they are taking their concerns to social media and the media. And so that, I think, that ability and willingness of employees to put out problematic information to the public domain and allow their employers to be judged on that, that's really new. Labor rights used to be, my pay, my benefits, and that kind of thing. We're now seeing employee activism targeting social issues and issues that are not necessarily in the pure self-interest of employees. So that's a really interesting dynamic to watch, and I don't think that's going anywhere in the context of the pandemic.
And I can corroborate that too. I mean, at Deloitte, where we have 270,000 people around the globe, I think our average age of everyone is 27, if you can believe it.
Wow.
And call it employee activism or employee engagement or what you like. It does push us, and I've seen it in a lot of other clients that I work with, to take positions, particularly on a public policy level, for particularly environmental questions and a lot of social questions that you just would not have expected companies to take positions on a few years ago. So I completely support that. I think that's one of the trends that will accelerate quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're coming up on about 10 minutes left here, and I just wanted to ask a final question, and it came back, coming back to the kind of new corporate governance codes in China and Japan and elsewhere, and that's to the panel is where is the leadership going to come from? We know that something is going to change, whether it's shareholder, stakeholder, something in between. Where do you see leadership coming from? Is it going to be a government-driven process? Is it going to be a private sector-driven process? Some combination of the two? And then is it going to be a nationally focused process, or is it going to rely on multilateral bodies like the OECD, the IFIs? Where is the leadership going to come through this process of change? And Dan, since I see Mark, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would. Again, it's hard to have a crystal ball here, and I think you can make an argument in a lot of cases, in a lot of ways. But I'll make the case for investors. I think that investors are going to drive a lot of change in a lot of places. We're seeing a tremendous increase in shareholder engagement and activism, whether it's ESG or more traditional issues. Many countries around the world, perhaps the U.S. is the big glaring exception here. Foreign investors represent far more than 30% of the average shareholding in large companies. That's, to me, the magic number. Once you hit 30% of foreign owners who have different priorities, and who are pushing management to make changes, that's when you start to see change. When you look at the history of when governance codes were introduced, from the UK to France to Japan. I mean, many of these, if you look at it, it happens when you hit 30% on ownership. The US is still a bit below that. We're, I think, barely at 20, could be even less. But I think that is often what will push people to make change. Now, is that consistent with the type of change we've been talking about all along? Not entirely. Investors have their own biases and own interests. But I do see increasing efforts in a lot of places, and I'm hopeful that a lot of change will come from there. So that's where I put my bet.
All right, Anat?
Well, thank you. So first, I agree. Definitely, investors are influencing. We're already seeing that they are influencing what we're seeing. I think personally, but again, I'm biased because I'm a legal scholar. We also have to have a push from the legal community. I'm just being honest. In the new paper that I'm writing, No More Old Boys Clubs, we're proposing something really different. It's never been done before, and that's with regards to fiduciary duties. Okay. Now, you're going to see some countries that are already going down that route, I don't know. I'm leaving it there as an open question with regard to the US, because I don't know if we are ready for that here. So that would be up for debate. But it goes something like this, and that is whether when you are a board member and you sit on a board of directors, when you're a director, you have a fiduciary duty. Is it part of your fiduciary duty to take these other interests, these social interests into account? And if you're not doing that, are you violating your fiduciary duty? Now, fiduciary duties are taken very seriously. And of course, nobody would want to get sued. And most of the time, nobody would sit on the board if they can get sued, right? And so this is really new. This is the first time that anything like this has been done before. And I want to see some comments on this, you know, from the academic community, from other communities. I'm curious to see, because we were thinking about other things like quotas, for example, and others. It's very hard. Okay, I understand. I think that's like the last resort. People don't want to get into anything that's forced on a company, and I get that. But if you look at it as a duty, as something that you owe to your investees, to your beneficiaries, to your shareholders, to your stakeholders, as a duty, and then if you own up to it, then it also exposes you to liability if you don't follow that. So I wonder if we change that discourse, and if we do that, if that will make a difference, because then people will have to take those things into account.
Great, great. And Allison?
The question is, where's change going to come from?
Where's the leadership? Where's the change coming from? Where's the leadership coming from?
That's a really good question. I mean, investors, and particularly huge asset owners, there was a staggering chart in the FT, I think in the last week, showing that large asset owners have more power and control of assets than almost anybody else. Yeah. So that's where we might hope it would come from. But I don't think, in the absence of public pressure and political will, that maybe will go as far as possible. I do hesitate to say that leadership will come from the government, but I do think we will see, and I'm mainly talking about the US context here, we will see a bit of a rethink about what the point of governance is, and what we need governments rather, and what we need governments for. We've already seen in the Trump presidency companies being much more willing than they were before to plunge in and take positions previously would have been pure play policy issues. I'm thinking about gun control, immigration, women's rights, that kind of thing. And very few people have questioned it. In fact, the response has been, well, the politicians aren't doing anything, so I'm really glad the CEOs are standing up, and CEOs are the new politicians. But we're now in a public health crisis, and there is a limit to what the private sector can do. And I think the private sector is, in fact, trying to negotiate and navigate what to tell their employees about healthcare, what to tell their employees about going back to work in the face of contradictory, confusing messages from the government. There's an ongoing debate about whether companies should be protected from liability because of making companies come back to work. So there's a very stark reminder that, in fact, the private sector isn't a government, that consumers aren't the electorate, and that we still need the government. Will that translate into a new model for political leadership and an end to polarization and a lack of dysfunction? I'm probably too cynical to say that, but I do think a rethink about what government is and what it's for versus the private sector will be happening.
All right, so I think that we captured what is I like to call the sunglasses effect, right? And so the old parable about where you're the world where there's two continents and two cultures, and everyone's born with different color sunglasses, and one person travels from one to the other, and they study there, they learn the language there, they fully integrate into the culture. And then they come back, and it's a blue, everyone's born blue or yellow sunglasses on. They come back to the blue continent, and they said, all the people wearing blue sunglasses say, what's it like over there? And I said, well, it's great, great, but everybody sees things as green. And so we bring some of our own biases into these predictions and into in our own background. And this issue of corporate governance and especially now the relationship between corporations and government is something that's really being brought to the forefront. And I think Anat, your perspective on legal and fiduciary is valid. And Allison, your perspective on the change and where it's coming from is also valid. And Dan, yours is as well. So I think it's not one thing, and it's everything. Maybe that's a bit, like the old Robert Frost's liberalism quip about how a liberal is a person that can, take every side except his own. Or maybe I'm butchering that, but. At the end of the day, change is coming, and we don't know exactly how it will form out. I think that we've laid out some interesting possibilities here, some interesting trends. So I thank everyone for participation and for the panelists. I thank you very much for your insight and your thoughts. So with that, it's 10:30 on the dot, and everyone needs to run to their own other conferences. So Dan, do you want to say one last thing?
No, just my pleasure being here. Thank you again.
Any last thoughts from Anat or Allison?
Just a thank you. It was a really good conversation. I feel like we could have gone on and on, but probably an hour and a half's enough.
Yes, and I just want to say I would love to hear from people. So if you would like to engage, if you'd like to tell me a little more about your thoughts on this, I would love to hear. And I'm hoping for change. I am always optimistic. So I'm hoping that we'll take this challenge and we'll be able to overcome in a positive way at the end. That's just
good words to end on. Thank you, Anat. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Dan. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.